Warren Steiner's father had taught him to tie his boots in the parking lot of the Dresser power plant when he was only 7 years old. The memory still came to him some mornings as he laced up, his small fingers fumbling with the worn laces, his father's calloused hands guiding him through the loops. Double knot, always double knot, his father had said. A man can't work with loose boots. On this particular morning in April 1983, Warren knotted his boots mechanically while sitting on the edge of his bed. The springs groaned beneath him as he shifted his weight. Through the thin walls of the house on South 13th Street, he could hear Rita in the kitchen, the familiar clink of the coffee pot against the mug she'd bought him for Father's Day 3 years before. The one with "World's Best Dad" written in fading letters. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 5:07 a.m. He'd been waking up at this hour for so long that his body didn't need the alarm anymore, but he set it anyway. Habit, structure, the foundation of his life. Warren tucked his gray uniform shirt into his pants and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror mounted on the closet door. At 42, his face had begun to settle into deep lines around his mouth and eyes. His dark hair was retreating steadily from his forehead, and what remained had gone silver at the temples. Looking at himself, he saw his father's face staring back. In the kitchen, Rita had already packed his lunch. Bologna sandwich, apple, thermos of coffee, same as every day for 19 years. "Morning," she said, not looking up from the newspaper spread on the formica table. Her bathrobe was cinched tightly at the waist, her hair still wrapped in pink curlers. "Frank called last night after you went to bed. Said Wanda's expecting again." Warren nodded, taking the lunch pail from the counter. "That'll be number 4 for them." Rita looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for something. He also mentioned something about more layoffs coming at the power station. Warren felt a familiar tightening in his chest but dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Frank's always hearing rumors. They've been saying that since '79. Coal's not going anywhere in Indiana. They just let go 50 men at the Fayette plant last month," Rita said, turning the page of the Terre Tribune. "Fayette's different. Older equipment." Warren sipped his coffee, scalding his tongue. "We just upgraded the scrubbers last year, $20 million. They wouldn't spend that kind of money if they were planning to cut back." Rita said nothing, just pressed her lips together in that way she had when she disagreed but wouldn't argue. After 19 years of marriage, he knew all her expressions. "I'll be home at 6, he said, bending to kiss the top of her head. She smelled like sleep and the lavender lotion she applied every night before bed. "Don't forget Billy's got practice after school." "I know our son's schedule, Warren." Her voice was tired, resigned. They'd been having variations of this same exchange for months now. The morning air was cool against his face as he stepped onto the porch. Across the street, Dave Milliken was also emerging from his house, lunch pail in hand. They'd been carpooling to the plant for nearly 12 years now. "Morning, Dave." "Warren," Dave nodded, his breath visible in the Prud'hon chill. His Pontiac Catalina sat in the driveway, its brown paint dulled by a winter's worth of salt and grime. The radio played softly as they drove through the sleeping streets of Terre Haute. Johnny Cash's "I Walk the Line" gave way to the news. The announcer's voice filled the car. "President Reagan continues to push his economic recovery program despite criticism from Democrats." In local news, Terre Haute's unemployment rate has risen to 11.3%, following national trends. Dave reached over and changed the station. "Too early for that depressing stuff." Warren nodded, staring out the window at the familiar landmarks sliding by. Terre Haute had been his home all his life. He'd been born in Union Hospital, graduated from Terre Haute North, and started at the power plant 2 weeks after getting his diploma. His father had worked there for 37 years before retiring. Warren had married Rita, a girl from his high school, and they'd bought a modest house 6 blocks from where he grew up. Their son Billy was now 16, already talking about following his father and grandfather into the plant after graduation. 3 generations of Steiners, that meant something. The Dresser power station appeared on the horizon, its 4 massive cooling towers pushing steam into the pale morning sky. The plant had been built in 1952, one of several coal-fired facilities in the Wabash River Valley. Warren had grown up in its shadow, watching the towers from his bedroom window, falling asleep to the distant hum of turbines. To him, those towers had always represented security, steadiness. The knowledge that tomorrow would be the same as today. The parking lot was half full when they arrived. Warren nodded to familiar faces as he and Dave made their way toward the employee entrance. He punched his time card at exactly 5:45 a.m. just as he had every weekday for the past 24 years. Steiner got a minute. It was Lloyd Parker, the shift supervisor, standing in the doorway of his office. Warren glanced at Dave, who shrugged and continued down the corridor toward the maintenance shop. Something wrong? Warren asked as he stepped into the small office. The walls were covered with safety posters and production charts. A family photo sat on the desk, Lloyd with his wife and two daughters at a lake somewhere. Lloyd gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Warren." Warren remained standing. Something in Lloyd's tone made him uneasy. They'd worked together for nearly 2 decades. He could read the tension in the other man's shoulders, the way he wouldn't meet Warren's eyes directly. "Just tell me straight, Lloyd." Lloyd sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I got a call from Indianapolis yesterday. Corporate's making cuts, big ones." The tightness in Warren's chest returned, stronger now. How big? "They're shutting down Units 3 and 4 by the end of the year." "Permanently?" Warren felt the room tilt slightly. Units 3 and 4 made up half the plant's generating capacity. "That's not possible. We just upgraded the emission systems. Why would they?" "Natural gas prices are dropping. New EPA regulations coming. They say coal can't compete anymore, not in the long run." Lloyd finally met Warren's eyes. "They're letting go 120 people. First round of notices goes out next week." Warren's mouth went dry. 120, that's almost a third of the workforce. Lloyd nodded. "I fought it, Warren, we all did. But the decisions are being made by people who have never even been to Terre. Warren thought of the men he'd worked alongside for decades. Men with mortgages, with children in school, with no other skills besides the ones they'd learned in this plant. "What about seniority?" he asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "It counts for something, but they're looking at positions, not just years. They need to keep specific roles filled to run the remaining units." Lloyd hesitated. "I can't make any promises, Warren, not even to you." The rest of the conversation faded into a blur of corporate terms and hollow reassurances. Warren nodded mechanically, asked appropriate questions, and eventually found himself walking down the corridor toward his workstation, feeling as if he were moving through water. The maintenance shop was already humming with activity. Dave looked up from the turbine part he was cleaning. What did Lloyd want? Warren opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He couldn't bring himself to say the words, to make them real by speaking them aloud. Instead, he reached for his tools and said, "Just some scheduling stuff." "Nothing important." The lie sat heavy on his tongue, but telling the truth would mean acknowledging that everything was about to change. And Warren Steiner had built his entire life on the belief that some things didn't change. The sun rose in the east, the Wabash flowed north to south, and the Dresser Power Station provided steady work for the men of Terre. That evening, Warren sat at the kitchen table, pushing meatloaf around his plate while Rita and Billy discussed the upcoming baseball season. Billy was the starting pitcher for Terre North, his lanky frame finally filling out with muscle after a growth spurt that had added 5 inches to his height in the past year. "Coach says I might have a shot at a scholarship if I can get my fastball over 85, Billy was saying, his voice animated in a way that it only was when he talked about baseball or cars. "That's great, honey," Rita said, passing him the mashed potatoes. "Warren, did you hear what Billy said?" Warren looked up, realizing he'd been lost in his thoughts. "Sorry, what?" "Dad, are you okay?" Billy asked, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You've been quiet ever since you got home." Warren forced a smile. "Just tired, big day at the plant." He turned to his son. "That's great about the scholarship possibility, you keep working at it." "I will," Billy hesitated. There's a scout coming to the game on Saturday from Indiana State. Could you maybe come watch? I know you usually work weekends, but..." Warren felt a pang of guilt. He'd missed too many of Billy's games over the years, always picking up extra shifts, always putting the plant first. "I'll be there," he said firmly. "Promise." After dinner, Warren retreated to the garage, where he kept his workbench and tools. This was his sanctuary, the place where he could think. The familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust enveloped him as he sat on the old wooden stool, staring at the pegboard wall where his tools hung in neat rows. He should tell Rita about the layoffs. She had a right to know that their future was suddenly uncertain. But saying it out loud would make it real, and Warren wasn't ready for that reality yet. Not when he'd spent his entire adult life believing in the certainty of his path. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Coal built this country, Warren. It'll be here long after we're gone." Howard Steiner had survived the Great Depression by working in the mines before moving to the power plant when it opened. He'd instilled in Warren a simple formula for life: work hard, be reliable, stay loyal to the company, and the company would take care of you. It was a covenant as solid as the ground beneath their feet. Now, sitting in his garage with the weight of Lloyd's news pressing down on him, Warren began to question whether that covenant had ever really existed at all. The next day at work, rumors were already circulating. Warren overheard conversations in the break room, saw the worried glances exchanged between men who had worked side by side for decades. No official announcement had been made, but in a place like the Dresser Power Station, news traveled fast. "Heard they're shutting down the whole south side," said Mike Dolan, a boiler operator who had started at the plant the same year as Warren. "That's not true," Warren said sharply. "It's just units 3 and 4. The room went silent. All eyes turned to Warren. "So it's true then?" asked Hank Wilcox, an electrician with 3 kids in college. "They're making cuts." Warren realized his mistake too late. He looked at the faces surrounding him, men whose livelihoods hung in the balance just like his own. "Lloyd talked to me yesterday," he admitted finally. "Said they're shutting down half the plant by year's end, about 120 positions eliminated." The silence that followed was deafening. Then everyone started talking at once, voices rising in anger, fear, disbelief. "They can't do that. I've got 18 years in. What about our pension plans? My boy just started community college." Warren slipped out of the break room, unable to face their questions when he had so few answers himself. He spent the rest of his shift methodically working through his tasks, taking comfort in the familiar routines. The whine of the turbines, the heat radiating from the boilers, the rhythmic ticking of gauges, these sounds and sensations had been the background of his life for so long that he couldn't imagine their absence. When his shift ended, Dave was waiting by the time clock. "You knew yesterday, didn't you?" Dave's voice was flat, accusatory. Warren nodded. "Lloyd told me, I couldn't say it out loud yet. We've been friends for 15 years, Warren. You should have told me." "I'm sorry," the words felt inadequate. "I was trying to process it myself." Dave was silent on the drive home, the radio filling the space between them. As they pulled up to Warren's house, Dave finally spoke. "Sarah's got MS. The diagnosis came through last month. Insurance from the plant is the only thing keeping us afloat with the medical bills." Warren felt sick. "Dave, I didn't know." "No, you didn't, because you never ask. You come to work, do your job, go home, like nothing outside those plant walls matters." Dave gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Some of us can't afford to lose our jobs, Warren. We don't all have fathers who left us houses with paid-off mortgages." The accusation stung, partly because it contained a grain of truth. Warren had inherited his parents' house after his mother died, selling it to put a down payment on the home he shared with Rita. His mortgage was manageable. He had savings. If he lost his job, they wouldn't be on the street immediately, but that didn't mean he wasn't afraid. "None of us can afford to lose our jobs," Warren said quietly. "We'll figure something out." Dave's laugh was bitter, right? Just like they figured something out for the guys at Inland Steel, or Bethlehem. "Wake up, Warren, this isn't a blip. This is the beginning of the end." As May turned to June, the official notices began to appear. White envelopes handed out at the end of shifts, containing either reassignment papers or termination notices. The plant became divided between the safe and the doomed, an invisible barrier forming between those who would remain and those who would be let go. Warren hadn't received an envelope yet, and the waiting gnawed at him. He'd finally told Rita about the cutbacks, and she'd taken the news with a stoicism that both comforted and unsettled him. "We'll be okay," she'd said, squeezing his hand across the kitchen table. "We've got savings, and I can pick up more hours at the hospital if needed." Rita worked part-time as a receptionist in the radiology department at Union Hospital. But it wasn't just about the money. Warren had never imagined himself as anything but a power plant worker. His identity, his sense of worth, his place in the community, all were tied to his job at Dresser. If that was taken away, who would he be? The question haunted him as June faded into July and the first round of layoffs took effect. He watched men he'd known for years clear out their lockers, saw the defeated slump of their shoulders as they walked out of the plant for the final time. Some cried, some raged, most just left quietly embarrassed by their misfortune, as if being laid off was somehow their own failure. Warren threw himself into his work with renewed dedication, arriving early, staying late, taking on additional responsibilities without being asked. If he worked hard enough, proved himself indispensable enough, surely they would keep him on. One Friday in late July, Lloyd called Warren into his office again. "Have a seat," he said, and this time Warren complied, his legs suddenly feeling weak. Lloyd slid a white envelope across the desk. Warren stared at it but didn't reach for it. "What is it?" he asked, though he already knew. "You're being reassigned," Lloyd said. "They're keeping you on, but you'll be moving to general maintenance. It's a step down in pay, about 15% less, but it's a job." Warren felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment wash over him. He wasn't being let go, but the position he'd held for over 2 decades was being eliminated. The specialized skills he'd developed, the knowledge he'd accumulated, none of it mattered anymore. "What about Dave?" Warren asked. "Dave Milliken, has he heard yet?" Lloyd's expression told him everything. Dave got his notice last week, end of August. Warren thought about Sarah Milliken and her medical bills, about the Millikens' 2 daughters, both still in high school. "That's not right, Lloyd. Dave's got 18 years in. He's got a sick wife." "It's not about right or wrong anymore, Warren. It's about numbers on a spreadsheet in some office in Indianapolis." Lloyd sounded tired, defeated. "Take the reassignment. At least you've still got a paycheck coming in." Warren picked up the envelope and left without another word. In the corridor, he passed Mike Dahlan, who was carrying a cardboard box filled with personal items from his locker. "Got my walking papers," Mike said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. 22 years and they can't even spring for a gold watch." Warren wanted to say something comforting, something that would acknowledge Mike's years of service, his dedication, his worth. But the words caught in his throat. "Take care of yourself, Mike," he managed finally. Mike nodded. "You too, Warren." "While you still can." That night Warren sat on the porch steps, watching the lightning bugs rise from the grass as dusk settled over South 13th Street. Rita came out and sat beside him, handing him a cold beer. "Billy's on the phone with Tina," she said, referring to their son's girlfriend of 6 months. "Sounds serious." Warren nodded absently, rolling the cold bottle between his palms. "You got your notice today, didn't you?" Rita asked softly. He looked at her, surprised. "How did you know?" "I've been married to you for 19 years, Warren. I know when something's eating at you." She placed her hand on his knee. "Are they letting you go?" "Reassignment, general maintenance." "Pay cut." He took a long swallow of beer. "Dave's losing his job entirely, end of August." Rita was quiet for a moment. "I'll call Sarah tomorrow, see if there's anything we can do to help." "What can we do?" "They're going to lose their insurance, Sarah's medical bills." Warren shook his head. "It's not right, Rita. None of this is right." "No, it's not," she agreed, "but it's happening whether it's right or not." They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, the street lights flickering on one by one. Across the street, the Jamesons were arguing again, their voices carrying through open windows. 2 houses down, the Ryans' new baby was crying. "Remember when we first moved here?" Rita asked suddenly. "How proud we were to have our own home." Warren nodded. They'd been so young. He was 23, she barely 21. Billy had been just a toddler, taking his first uncertain steps across this very porch. "I used to imagine growing old in this house," Rita continued, "rocking on the porch, watching our grandchildren play in the yard." "We still can," Warren said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rita turned to look at him directly. "Can we be honest, Warren? What's happening at the plant? Is this temporary? Or is Dave right? Is this the beginning of the end?" Warren thought about the closed units, the empty parking spaces, the men carrying out boxes of personal items. He thought about the natural gas pipelines being built across the Midwest, the newspaper articles about clean energy, the changing regulations. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I always thought coal was forever. My dad always said." He broke off, unable to continue. Rita squeezed his hand. "Your father lived in a different world, Warren." "Things change." "Not everything has to change." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. "No, not everything, but some things do whether we want them to or not." Rita stood up, brushing off her jeans. "Come to bed soon." "It's getting late." As she went inside, Warren remained on the steps, nursing his beer and watching the occasional car pass by on South 13th Street. From somewhere in the distance, he could hear the low rumble of a train, probably carrying coal to one of the remaining power plants along the Wabash. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a future in which the Dresser Power Station no longer existed. A future where the massive cooling towers no longer pushed steam into the Indiana sky, where the parking lot stood empty, where the hum of turbines was silenced forever. The thought made him feel hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of his chest. The following Monday, Warren reported to his new position in general maintenance. The reassignment meant he would be handling basic repairs throughout the plant, rather than specializing in the turbine systems, as he had for the past 15 years. His new supervisor was Jerry Atkins, a man 10 years his junior who had only been with the company for 8 years. "Glad to have you on the team, Warren," Jerry said, handing him a stack of work orders. "We're pretty backed up with all the transitions happening." Warren took the papers without comment. He understood what was happening. General maintenance was becoming a dumping ground for employees they didn't want to fire outright but whose specialized roles had been eliminated. It was a kind of purgatory, not quite fired, but no longer valued for your expertise. As the weeks passed, Warren adjusted to his new role. The work was less demanding technically but more physically taxing. By the end of each shift, his back ached from crawling into tight spaces to fix leaking pipes or replace worn belts. His hands, once precise instruments for the delicate work of turbine maintenance, now blistered from gripping wrenches and hammers all day. Dave's last day came at the end of August. Warren drove him to work that morning as usual, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. When they arrived at the plant, Dave sat motionless in the passenger seat, staring at the cooling towers looming against the pale morning sky. 27 years, he said finally. "I started when I was 19 years old, never worked anywhere else." Warren didn't know what to say. No words could bridge the gulf that had opened between them, one man still employed, the other cast aside. "I'll drive you home after shift," Warren offered. Dave shook his head. "Sarah's picking me up, we're going straight to the unemployment office." That evening, Warren drove home alone for the first time in years. The car felt too quiet without Dave beside him. At a stoplight, he impulsively turned left instead of right, heading away from South 13th Street. 20 minutes later, he found himself parked on a bluff overlooking the Wabash River, with the Dresser Power Station visible in the distance. From this vantage point, he could see all 4 cooling towers, though only 2 were currently emitting steam. The other 2 stood silent, already looking abandoned, though they'd only been shut down for a few months. Warren sat on the hood of his car, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the river valley. The plant looked different from up here, smaller somehow, less permanent. Just another industrial complex on the banks of a river that had seen countless such structures rise and fall over the centuries. His father had brought him to this same spot when he was a boy, pointing proudly to the plant where he worked. "See those towers, Warren, they're building the future down there. And someday you'll be part of it too." Now Warren wondered what his father would say if he could see what was happening. Would he understand that the world was changing, or would he, like Warren, feel betrayed by the broken promises, the discarded loyalties? As darkness fell, the lights of the plant came on, a constellation of yellow and white against the deepening blue of evening. Warren sat until the stars appeared, until the temperature dropped enough to make him shiver. Then he started his car and drove home to South 13th Street, where Rita was waiting with a plate of meatloaf kept warm in the oven. By October, the reality of the plant's decline was impossible to ignore. Units 3 and 4 had been fully decommissioned, their massive equipment sitting dormant behind locked doors. The workforce had been cut from 380 to fewer than 250. The parking lot, once full to capacity during shift changes, now had entire sections empty at all hours. Warren's new schedule meant he worked primarily on Units 1 and 2, handling the maintenance tasks that kept the remaining operations functioning. The work was steadier than he'd expected. Aging equipment required constant attention, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Gone was the camaraderie, the sense of shared purpose. In its place was a pervasive anxiety, each remaining employee wondering if they would be next. One Wednesday morning in late October, Warren was repairing a valve in the basement level of Unit 1 when the lights flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, he heard the distant sound of machinery powering down, a low, moaning whine that raised the hair on the back of his neck. His flashlight revealed a narrow pathway through the maze of pipes. He followed it toward the stairs, encountering other workers similarly navigating by flashlight beam. No one seemed to know what had happened. In the main control room, emergency lights cast an eerie glow over the instrument panels. Lloyd was on the phone, his face tense as he listened to someone on the other end. "What's going on?" Warren asked one of the control room operators. "Transformer blew on the main transmission line," the man replied. "Whole plant's offline." Warren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's perpetual dampness. A complete shutdown was rare and dangerous. Restarting coal-fired units was a complex, time-consuming process. Lloyd hung up the phone and addressed the gathered employees. "We've got a major failure in the switchyard. Transmission lines down. We're on emergency power only, and we need to secure all systems immediately." For the next 12 hours, Warren worked alongside his colleagues to safely shut down the remaining systems and prevent any secondary damage from the power loss. It was nearly midnight when Lloyd finally told them to go home. "We'll assess the damage tomorrow," he said, his voice hoarse from giving orders all day. "Report back at your usual times." The next morning, Warren arrived to find several unmarked cars in the executive's parking area. Men in suits were walking the perimeter of the switchyard with clipboards, occasionally stopping to take photographs of the damaged equipment. "Who are they?" Warren asked Jerry as they stood watching from the maintenance shop window. "Corporate guys from Indianapolis and some insurance adjusters, I think." Jerry lowered his voice. "I heard it's going to cost millions to repair the transformer. The thing was installed in the 50s, and the replacement parts have to be custom manufactured." Warren thought about what that meant. Millions of dollars to repair a plant that was already operating at half capacity, already losing money according to the rumors that circulated among the workforce. Later that day, the plant manager called an all-hands meeting in the cafeteria. Jacob Reynolds was a thin, nervous man who had been transferred from another facility just 6 months earlier. He stood before the assembled workers, his hands clasping and unclasping as he delivered the news. "As you know, we experienced a catastrophic failure in our main transformer yesterday. After a thorough assessment, corporate has determined that the cost of repairs, combined with the ongoing market challenges facing coal generation, make it economically unfeasible to continue operations at Dresser Station." He paused, swallowing hard. "The decision has been made to accelerate our closure timeline. Units 1 and 2 will not be brought back online. The plant will be decommissioned, effective immediately." The cafeteria erupted in shouts and questions. Warren sat motionless, the words echoing in his head, "Effective immediately, not next year, not in 6 months. Now, what about our jobs?" someone called out. "What about our contracts?" Reynolds raised his hands, pleading for quiet. "All employees will receive 60 days' notice as required by law. Severance packages will be based on years of service. HR representatives will be available starting tomorrow to discuss your individual situations." Warren barely heard the rest of the announcement. His mind was racing, calculating mortgage payments, insurance costs, Billy's college expenses. They had savings, but how long would those last, and what would he do afterward? At 42, with only a high school education and skills specific to a dying industry, what were his options? As the meeting broke up, men gathered in small groups, their faces showing varying degrees of shock, anger, and fear. Warren found himself standing next to Lloyd, who looked 10 years older than he had the day before. "Did you know?" Warren asked quietly. Lloyd shook his head. "They told me an hour before the meeting. I've been with this company for 30 years and they gave me 60 minutes notice that my career is over." He laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. "You know what the VP from Indianapolis said to me?" He said, "This is just business, nothing personal." As if putting 200 people out of work isn't personal. Warren nodded. He understood completely. For men like them, work wasn't just a paycheck. It was identity, purpose, community. There was nothing more personal than taking that away. "What will you do?" Warren asked. Lloyd shrugged. "My brother-in-law has a hardware store in Bloomington. Been trying to get me to come work for him for years. Guess I'll finally take him up on it." He looked at Warren. "What about you?" "I don't know," Warren admitted. "I really don't know." The drive home that afternoon was surreal. The October sun was shining, children were playing in yards along South 13th Street, and Warren's entire world had just collapsed. He sat in his car in the driveway for several minutes, unable to make himself go inside and tell Rita that the fear they'd been living with for months had finally materialized in the worst possible way. When he did enter the house, he found Rita already home from her shift at the hospital, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. One look at his face told her everything. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked. Warren nodded, sinking into a chair across from her. "Transformer blew yesterday. They're not fixing it. The whole plant's closing, effective immediately." Rita reached across the table and took his hand. Her palm was warm from the teacup, her fingers squeezing his with surprising strength. "We knew this was coming, Warren. We've been preparing." Had they been preparing? Warren had been hoping, praying that somehow the plant would survive, that his position would be spared, that everything would go back to normal. He hadn't been preparing for this finality. What am I supposed to do now, Rita? I'm 42 years old. I've never worked anywhere else. You'll find something, she said with a certainty he couldn't feel. You're smart, you're a hard worker. Those skills transfer. To what? What company is looking to hire a middle-aged man whose only experience is maintaining equipment that's becoming obsolete? The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Rita was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup in slow circles. Remember when we first met, you were working on that old Chevy in your parents' garage. Warren nodded, unsure where she was going with this. You told me you were going to open your own garage someday. That was your dream before your dad got you the job at the plant. Warren had almost forgotten that youthful ambition. At 18, he'd loved nothing more than taking engines apart and putting them back together. But then his father had secured him a position at Dresser with its steady paycheck and benefits, and that dream had been set aside. That was a kid's fantasy, he said dismissively. Opening a garage takes money, equipment, a building. We can't afford that, especially not now. Maybe not right away, Rita conceded, but it's something to think about. A direction to move in. Warren couldn't imagine it. The leap from the security he'd known to the uncertainty of self-employment seemed impossibly vast. Billy came home a short time later, his baseball gear slung over one shoulder. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, sensing the tension. What's wrong? He asked, looking from Warren to Rita and back again. The plant's closing, Warren said, for good this time. Billy set down his gear slowly. At 16, he was already as tall as Warren, his face showing the first signs of the man he would become. So what happens now? It was the question Warren had been asking himself all day. What happens now? What happens to a man whose entire identity has been tied to a job that no longer exists? What happens to a family that has built its life around the certainty of that job? What happens to a town when one of its economic pillars crumbles? Now we figure it out, Rita answered for him, her voice steady. Together as a family. The next morning, Warren drove to the plant one last time. Not for a shift, there would be no more of those, but to clean out his locker and turn in his ID badge. The parking lot was half empty, the remaining spaces filled by employees on the same grim errand. Inside, the plant felt different already. The familiar hum of machinery was absent, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the echoing footsteps of men moving through the corridors. In the locker room, Warren methodically emptied the metal cabinet that had held his belongings for more than 2 decades. Work gloves, spare socks, a paperback western he'd been reading during lunch breaks, a coffee mug stained with years of use. He placed each item in a cardboard box, aware of the similar activity taking place around him as other men packed up their own histories. Hell of a thing, isn't it? The voice belonged to Hank Wilcox, the electrician who had worried about his college-aged children months earlier when the first layoffs were announced. Warren nodded, never thought I'd see it. My old man worked 40 years at the steel mill in Gary, Hank said, folding a flannel shirt and placing it in his box. When they shut it down in '79, he said it was like watching a funeral for a whole way of life. I didn't understand what he meant until now. Warren thought about his own father, who had passed away 5 years earlier. Perhaps it was a blessing that Howard Steiner hadn't lived to see this day, hadn't had to witness the closure of the plant that had been his livelihood, his pride. What will you do? Warren asked Hank. Got a brother-in-law in Cincinnati, works for General Electric, says they might be hiring electricians. Hank shrugged. Hate to leave Terre, but what choice do I have? What choice did any of them have? As Warren made his final walk through the plant, he passed dozens of men he'd worked alongside for years, each facing the same uncertain future. Some were angry, their voices loud as they cursed the company, the economy, the government. Others were quiet, stunned, as if they still couldn't believe what was happening. His last stop was the Human Resources office, where a young woman he didn't recognize handed him an envelope containing information about his severance package and the continuation of health benefits. 60 days pay plus 1 week for every year of service. Insurance coverage for 3 months after that, a form letter thanking him for his years of dedicated service to the company. You'll need to turn in your ID badge and sign these papers, the woman said, her voice professionally sympathetic. Warren did as instructed, feeling a strange sense of detachment as he signed away 24 years of his life. When he handed back the clipboard, the woman smiled mechanically and said, "Good luck with your future endeavors, Mr. Steiner." Future endeavors, as if losing his job at 42 was an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. Outside, Warren stood in the parking lot, looking up at the cooling towers one last time. Two of them still bore faint traces of steam, the remaining heat in the system dissipating into the autumn air. Soon they would stand completely cold and silent, monuments to an era that was ending not just in Terre but across America. He placed his box of belongings in the trunk of his car and drove away from the Dresser power station for the final time. The next 60 days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and increasingly desperate job searches. Warren applied for positions at the remaining industrial facilities in Terre, a paper mill, a chemical plant, a few smaller manufacturing operations, but quickly discovered that he was one of hundreds of former power plant employees competing for a handful of openings. He expanded his search to Indianapolis, Bloomington, even as far as Chicago, but the story was the same everywhere. The skills that had made him valuable at Dresser didn't translate easily to other industries, and employers were hesitant to hire a 42-year-old man who would need retraining. Each rejection letter, each unanswered application, each phone call that ended with "we'll keep your resume on file" chipped away at Warren's sense of self-worth. He had always defined himself by his work, by his ability to provide, to fix things to be needed. Without that, he felt increasingly hollow, adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for him. Rita watched his struggle with a mixture of concern and frustration. She had increased her hours at the hospital, moving from part-time to full-time to help cover the household expenses. In the evenings, she would sit with Warren at the kitchen table, going through want ads, making suggestions that he invariably dismissed as impractical or beneath his skills. "The Columbia Gas Distribution Center is hiring," she said one night in early December, pointing to a classified ad in the Tribune. "Warehouse work, but the pay is decent." Warren shook his head. "They want people with warehouse experience. I'd be starting at entry level at my age." So, Rita's patience was wearing thin. "Entry level is better than no level, Warren." "You don't understand," he said, pushing away from the table. "I was a skilled technician. I had responsibilities, respect. I can't just go from that to loading trucks or whatever." "Why not?" Rita's voice rose slightly. "Do you think you're too good for that kind of work? Is your pride worth more than keeping a roof over our heads?" The question hung in the air between them. Was it pride? Warren had never thought of himself as a proud man. He'd always valued hard work, regardless of the task. But the thought of starting over at the bottom, of being the new guy, the inexperienced one, after decades of mastery, it felt like a surrender he wasn't ready to make. "My severance will carry us through March," he said finally. "I'll find something by then." Rita looked as if she wanted to say more, but instead rose and began clearing the dinner dishes with sharp, angry movements. Warren retreated to the living room, where Billy was watching television. "Everything okay?" Billy asked, glancing toward the kitchen where Rita was running water with more force than necessary. "Fine," Warren said automatically. Then, seeing the worry in his son's eyes, he amended. "Just a difference of opinion about job hunting." Billy nodded, turning back to the TV. After a moment, he said, "Coach Benson's dad owns that auto parts store on Wabash Avenue. Coach mentioned they might be hiring a counter person." Warren felt a flicker of irritation. Now his 16-year-old son was trying to find him work. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm looking for something more in line with my experience." "Just trying to help," Billy said quietly. The guilt hit Warren immediately. Billy was only doing what he'd been taught, taking initiative, trying to solve a problem. "I know you are, son, thank you, I'll check it out tomorrow." He didn't check it out, though. The next day, he drove to Indianapolis for an interview at a manufacturing plant, only to discover that the position had already been filled. The HR representative barely glanced at his resume before handing it back with a practiced smile, and a "we'll call if anything else opens up." On the drive back to Terre, a light snow began to fall, the first of the season. Warren pulled off the highway at a rest stop and sat watching the flakes accumulate on the windshield. He felt exhausted, not just physically but deep in his soul. The constant rejection, the growing tension at home, the dwindling bank account, it was all becoming too much to bear. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that perhaps Rita was right. Perhaps he did need to lower his expectations, to accept that the kind of job he'd had at Dresser might never come again. The thought filled him with a profound sadness, a sense of loss that went beyond the practical concerns of income and benefits. When he arrived home that evening, the house was quiet. Rita had left a note on the refrigerator. She was working a double shift at the hospital, covering for a colleague who was sick. Billy was at a friend's house studying for exams. Warren found himself alone with his thoughts, wandering from room to room in the house that suddenly seemed too big, too empty. In the garage, he flipped on the light and stood looking at his workbench. The tools hung in their familiar places, the surface clear and organized as always. This space had been his refuge for years, a place where problems had clear solutions, where broken things could be fixed with the right knowledge and the right tools. On impulse, he pulled the tarp off the old Chevy engine block that sat in the corner. He'd bought it at a junkyard the previous summer, intending to rebuild it as a project with Billy. But then the first layoffs had happened, and the project had been forgotten in the stress that followed. Warren ran his hand over the cast iron, feeling the familiar contours. This, at least, he understood. This he could control. He pulled his toolbox closer and began to disassemble the engine, methodically removing the valve covers, the intake manifold, the carburetor. Hours passed as he worked, his hands remembering skills that his mind had nearly forgotten. It was past midnight when he heard the back door open and close, followed by Rita's tired footsteps in the kitchen. A moment later, she appeared in the garage doorway, still wearing her hospital scrubs. "What are you doing?" she asked, looking at the disassembled engine parts spread across the workbench. Warren set down the wrench he was holding, just working on something. Rita came closer, surveying the organized chaos of the workbench. "The Chevy engine, I forgot about this." "So did I." Warren wiped his hands on a rag. "How was your shift?" "Long, busy." She leaned against the workbench. "Did the interview go well?" Warren shook his head. "Position was filled already." Rita nodded, unsurprised. They'd been through this enough times now that disappointment was becoming routine. "You look happier than you have in weeks," she observed. "Working on this engine." Warren hadn't realized it, but she was right. For the first time since the plant closed, he had lost track of time, had been fully absorbed in a task that engaged his skills and his mind. "I guess I needed to fix something," he admitted. Rita was quiet for a moment, watching him. Then she said, "Do you remember Faye Kowalski? She used to work in radiology before she moved to administration." Warren nodded vaguely. He had met Rita's coworkers at hospital functions over the years, but couldn't place the name immediately. Her husband Joe runs that auto repair shop on 3rd Street, Kowalski's. She mentioned today that he's looking for a mechanic. Someone experienced. Warren felt a familiar resistance rise within him. "Rita, I've told you, I'm not a professional mechanic. What I do here in the garage is different from—" "You've been taking apart engines since you were 16, Rita interrupted. "You rebuilt my brother's transmission when the dealership said it couldn't be done. You fixed every car we've ever owned." Her voice softened. "You're happiest when you're working with your hands, solving problems. I saw it the minute I walked in just now." Warren looked down at his oil-stained hands, then at the engine components laid out with methodical precision on the workbench. What Rita was saying made sense, but it would mean giving up on the idea of returning to the kind of work he'd done for 2 decades. It would mean starting over in a field where he had no professional credentials, no formal training. "I don't even know if Joe would hire me," he said finally, "and the pay would probably be a lot less than I was making at Dresser." "Probably," Rita agreed, "at least at first, but it's something to consider, isn't it? Something that might actually make you happy, not just pay the bills." She was right, Warren realized. The happiest memories of his youth were of afternoons spent in his parents' garage, hands deep in an engine, the satisfaction of making something work again. The power plant job had come along and offered security, benefits, status, all the things a responsible family man was supposed to prioritize, and he had for 24 years. Maybe now in this unwanted transition, there was an opportunity to rediscover something he'd set aside long ago. "I'll talk to Joe tomorrow," he said, "see what he's offering." Rita smiled, the tension that had been building between them over the past weeks visibly easing. "That's all I'm asking, just talk to him," she yawned, covering her mouth with the back of her hand. "I'm going to bed, don't stay up too late." After she left, Warren turned back to the engine, but his mind was elsewhere. The idea of working as a mechanic, a real professional mechanic, was both exciting and terrifying. What if he wasn't good enough? What if the skills he'd developed as a hobbyist didn't translate to the demands of a commercial garage? But what was the alternative? Continue sending out applications for jobs he didn't really want, jobs that would leave him feeling like a pale imitation of the man he'd been at Dresser. Or take a chance on something new, something that might actually engage the parts of himself that had been lying dormant for years. The next morning, Warren put on his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-up shirt and drove to Kowalski's Auto Repair on 3rd Street. The shop was a large cinder-block building with 3 service bays, all currently occupied by vehicles in various states of repair. A small office area was visible through a glass window, where a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair sat at a desk, speaking on the phone. Warren waited until the man hung up, then entered the office. "Joe Kowalski?" he asked. The man nodded, looking Warren up and down with assessing eyes. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I'm Warren Steiner. My wife Rita works with your wife at the hospital." Warren extended his hand, which Joe shook firmly. "I understand you might be looking for a mechanic." Recognition dawned on Joe's face. "Rita's husband, sure. Heard you got caught in the dresser shutdown. Tough break." Warren nodded. "I worked in turbine maintenance for the last 15 years, before that boiler systems." "Not a lot of turbines to maintain at an auto shop," Joe said with a wry smile. "You have experience with cars." "Not professional experience, no, but I've been working on engines since I was a teenager, rebuilt quite a few over the years, mostly as a hobby." Warren hesitated, then added, "I'm a quick learner. I understand mechanical systems, and I know how to work hard." Joe considered him for a moment, then stood up from his desk. "Come take a look at something." He led Warren into the shop area, past 2 bays where mechanics were working, to the 3rd bay where a Ford F-150 sat with its hood open. "This truck's been giving us fits for 3 days. Customer says it runs rough, stalls out at stoplights. We've replaced the fuel filter, checked the lines, tested the pump. Problem persists." Joe gestured to the engine. "Any thoughts?" Warren knew this was a test, and probably an unfair one. Being put on the spot to diagnose a problem that had stumped professionals wasn't exactly a level playing field, but he also knew this might be his only chance. He approached the truck and began a systematic examination of the engine compartment. He checked the obvious things first: vacuum lines, electrical connections, the condition of belts and hoses. Then he moved to the less obvious: the EGR valve, the throttle body, the ignition module. Something caught his eye: a slight discoloration on one of the spark plug wires where it passed near the exhaust manifold. He traced the wire back to the distributor cap, examining it more closely. "When's the last time the cap and rotor were replaced?" he asked. Joe shrugged. "Not since it's been in here. We checked the plugs, they looked okay." Warren pulled a multimeter from a nearby toolbox and began testing the spark plug wires one by one. When he reached the suspect wire, the meter showed significantly higher resistance than the others. "Wire's breaking down internally," he said, pointing to the discolored section. "Probably from heat exposure. It's causing a weak spark to that cylinder, especially when the engine's hot. That would explain the rough running and stalling." Joe looked at the wire, then at Warren, his expression unreadable. "And your solution would be?" "Replace all the plug wires as a set. Probably the cap and rotor too, since they're wear items that work together. And I'd reroute this wire farther from the exhaust manifold when installing the new set." Joe was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That makes sense, might be exactly what we're missing." He turned to one of the other mechanics. "Tim, get a set of plug wires for this F-150, and a cap and rotor kit." As Tim moved to comply, Joe led Warren back to the office. "You've got good instincts," he said, settling back behind his desk. "But there's a big difference between tinkering in your garage and working on customers' vehicles all day. There are time pressures, warranty concerns, safety issues." "I understand that," Warren said. "I'm not claiming to be an ASE-certified master tech, but I'm willing to learn, to put in the time to get certified if necessary." Joe studied him for a long moment. "Tell you what, I need someone 3 days a week to start. Pays $15 an hour, which I'm guessing is less than you made at Dresser." It was significantly less, almost 40% lower than his final rate at the power plant. But it was also 40% more than the $0 he was currently earning. "When can I start?" Warren asked. Joe seemed surprised by the quick acceptance. "Monday work for you, 8 to 5 with a half-hour lunch. We'll see how it goes for a couple of weeks, then reassess." Warren nodded, extending his hand across the desk. "I'll be here." As he drove home, Warren felt a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite sort out. Relief at having found employment, apprehension about starting a new career at 42, uncertainty about whether he'd made the right decision. But underneath it all was something he hadn't felt since the day the plant closed: a quiet sense of possibility. When he told Rita the news, her face lit up with genuine happiness for the first time in months. "I knew Joe would recognize what you can do," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "This could be a new beginning, Warren. Not just a job, but something you might actually enjoy." Warren wasn't ready to embrace that level of optimism, but he appreciated her support. "It's a start," he conceded. "Less money, no benefits yet, but it's something." "We'll figure out the rest," Rita said with the practical determination that had always been her strength. "The important thing is that you're moving forward." Moving forward. The phrase stuck with Warren as he prepared for his first day at Kowalski's. Was that what he was doing, or was he simply grabbing at whatever employment he could find, settling for less than he deserved because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate? He didn't have answers, only questions that circled in his mind as he lay awake the night before his first day, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the future held for a man whose past had been built on foundations that no longer existed. Warren arrived at Kowalski's auto repair 15 minutes early on Monday morning, dressed in the new work pants and steel-toed boots he'd bought over the weekend. Joe was already there, unlocking the service bays and turning on lights. "Morning," Joe nodded, handing Warren a time card. "Clock in at that machine by the office door. Tim and Ray will be in soon. They'll show you the ropes, where tools are kept, how we log work orders, all that." Warren clocked in, feeling strangely formal about a process he'd taken for granted for decades at Dresser. A new time card, a new beginning. He followed Joe through the shop as the older man pointed out the organization of tools, parts, diagnostic equipment. "We try to keep things orderly," Joe explained. "Time is money in this business. Can't spend half an hour looking for a 10mm socket when a customer's waiting." Warren nodded, appreciating the logic. It wasn't so different from the maintenance shop at the power plant, where efficiency had been equally important. Some skills, it seemed, did transfer across industries. When Tim and Ray arrived, Joe introduced Warren briefly, then left him in their hands while he returned to the office to manage the day's appointments. Tim was in his 30s, with a sleeve of tattoos and a quick, easy manner. Ray was older, maybe 55, taciturn and precise in his movements. "New guy from the power plant, huh?" Tim said as he set up his workstation. "My uncle got laid off from there too. Found work over at the Sony plant in Terre, Haute." Warren had applied there himself, but had been told they weren't hiring in maintenance. Another door closed during those desperate months of job hunting. "Joe says you diagnosed that F-150 issue on Friday," Ray commented, eyeing Warren with a measuring gaze. "Lucky guess, or do you actually know your way around an engine?" "Bit of both," Warren admitted. "I've worked on cars as a hobby for years, but I've got a lot to learn about doing it professionally." Ray seemed to appreciate the honest answer. "Well, stick close to me today, I'll show you our system. We're not the dealer, but we're not a quick lube place either. We do quality work here." The first customer arrived promptly at 8, an elderly woman with a Buick that was making a terrible racket whenever she turned the steering wheel. Ray assigned Warren to assist him with the diagnosis, which turned out to be a failing power steering pump. "You take the lead on the replacement," Ray instructed, handing Warren the work order. "I'll watch, jump in if needed." Warren felt a flutter of nervousness as he gathered the tools and parts for the job. This wasn't his garage at home, where time didn't matter and mistakes could be corrected at leisure. This was a paying customer's vehicle, and his performance would directly affect both the shop's reputation and his own future employment. He worked methodically, drawing on memories of similar repairs he'd done over the years. The process was familiar, but the context new: the weight of Ray's watchful eye, the knowledge that someone was paying for his time, the responsibility of doing the job right the first time. "Not bad," Ray commented when Warren had finished, the new pump installed and bled of air. "A little slow, but that'll improve with practice. The important thing is you did it right." Warren felt a small surge of pride at the grudging approval. By lunchtime, he had assisted on 3 more jobs: a brake pad replacement, a starter motor swap, and a diagnosis of a check engine light that turned out to be a faulty oxygen sensor. As the day progressed, Warren began to relax into the rhythm of the shop. The work was physically demanding in different ways than the power plant had been: more climbing in and out of vehicles, more awkward positions, more direct contact with customers. But there was a satisfying concreteness to it, a clear relationship between problem and solution that appealed to his methodical nature. "You're picking things up quick," Tim commented as they washed up at the end of the day. "Joe made a good call bringing you on." Warren appreciated the vote of confidence but knew he had a long way to go. There's still a lot I don't know, he admitted. Especially on the newer vehicles with all the electronics. Nobody knows everything, Tim shrugged. That's why we've got those diagnostic computers, and even they get it wrong half the time. The important thing is understanding how systems work together, and you've got that down. As Warren clocked out and drove home, he realized with some surprise that the day had passed quickly. Unlike the dragging hours of his job search or even the routine familiarity of his later years at Dresser, this day had engaged his mind and his hands in ways that left him tired but satisfied. At dinner, Rita and Billy listened intently as he described his first day, the vehicles he'd worked on, the dynamics of the shop. Warren found himself speaking with an animation he hadn't felt in months. "So you like it?" Billy asked, helping himself to a second serving of lasagna. Warren considered the question. "It's different," he said finally. "Harder in some ways, easier in others, but yeah, I think I could like it." The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Warren worked Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at Kowalski's, gradually taking on more complex jobs as his confidence and skill increased. On his days off, he studied repair manuals and online tutorials, determined to close the knowledge gap between himself and his colleagues who had formal training or years of professional experience. The pay was still an issue, even with Rita's full-time hospital salary. They were bringing in significantly less than when Warren had been at Dresser. They cut expenses where they could, fewer meals out, no new clothes, a careful eye on the electric bill. Warren's severance package helped bridge the gap, but it wouldn't last forever. One evening in early February, Joe called Warren at home. "Got a proposition for you," he said without preamble. "Ray's retiring end of March. Moving to Florida to be near his daughter. I need someone full-time to replace him." Warren felt his pulse quicken. "Are you offering me the position?" "Thinking about it," Joe said. "You've picked things up faster than I expected. Customers like you, Tim says you're easy to work with, but there's the issue of certification." Warren had been researching this himself. ASE certification, the industry standard for automotive technicians, required both testing and documented work experience, which he didn't yet have. "I'm willing to get certified," Warren said. "I've been studying for the tests already." "Good, because I need someone certified if I'm going to pay what Ray's making. Insurance requires it, and frankly, so do I." Joe paused. "Here's what I'm proposing. You come on full-time now. I'll pay you $17.50 an hour to start. When you get your first certification, we bump that to 19. Get 3 more within a year, we go to 22. That's what Ray's making now." It was still less than Warren had made at his peak at Dresser, but it was a clear path forward, a progression that acknowledged his growing skills and commitment. "In benefits?" Warren asked, thinking of health insurance, which they were currently paying for out of pocket at an exorbitant rate. "After 90 days full-time, you're eligible for our health plan. It's not gold-plated, but it covers the basics. 2 weeks paid vacation after a year." Joe cleared his throat. "I know it's not what you were used to at the plant, Warren. But it's what a small business like mine can offer." Warren thought about it for only a moment. "I appreciate the opportunity, Joe. I accept." When he hung up the phone and told Rita the news, she wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice muffled. "So proud of how you've handled all of this." Warren wasn't sure he deserved her pride. For months, he'd been angry, resistant, clinging to the past instead of embracing the possibilities of the future. It had taken the complete collapse of his former life to force him to consider alternatives. If the Dresser plant hadn't closed, he'd still be there, still defining himself by a job that, he now realized, had become more habit than passion in his later years. "I should have listened to you sooner," he admitted, "about looking into mechanic work." Rita leaned back to look up at him. "You weren't ready then. Sometimes we have to lose something before we can see what's right in front of us." What had been right in front of him, literally in his own garage, was a skill and an interest that had been part of his life since before Dresser, before marriage, before all the responsibilities that had gradually narrowed his vision to a single path. The path hadn't been wrong exactly. It had provided for his family, given structure to his days, connected him to a community of fellow workers, but it had also limited how he saw himself, what he believed was possible. In early April 1984, Warren received his first ASE certification in automobile engine repair, scoring well above the passing threshold. Joe made good on his promise, raising Warren's hourly rate to $19 and assigning him primary responsibility for engine work in the shop. The transition wasn't always smooth. There were days when Warren missed the familiarity of the power plant, the camaraderie of men he'd worked alongside for decades, the security of knowing exactly what was expected of him. There were moments of frustration when a repair job took longer than anticipated, or when a particularly challenging diagnostic problem left him questioning his abilities. But there were also moments of deep satisfaction, the purr of an engine he'd rebuilt, the gratitude of a customer whose vehicle ran better than it had in years, the growing confidence that came with mastering new skills. Warren found himself looking forward to work in a way he hadn't in the final years at Dresser, when the job had become more obligation than opportunity. One Saturday in late spring, Warren was working on his old Chevy in the garage when Billy came out to join him. At 17 now, Billy had his father's build and mechanical aptitude. He'd been helping with garage projects since he was old enough to hold a wrench, but lately, his interests had turned more toward college and career plans. "How's it coming?" Billy asked, looking at the partially reassembled engine. "Getting there," Warren replied, tightening a bolt on the valve cover. "Hand me that torque wrench, will you?" Billy passed the tool, then leaned against the workbench. "Dad, I've been thinking about something. I need your advice." Warren looked up, noting the serious tone in his son's voice. "What's on your mind?" "Coach Benson thinks I could get a baseball scholarship to Purdue, not a full ride, but enough to help with tuition." Billy hesitated. "But I'd have to commit to their program, which means I'd have to decide on a major soon." Warren nodded, waiting for the question. "I've been thinking about mechanical engineering," Billy continued, "but I'm not sure if that's practical with how things are changing, I mean." Warren understood immediately what his son was asking. In a world where factories were closing, where traditional industrial jobs were disappearing, was engineering still a viable career path? Or was Billy witnessing his father's struggle and drawing the conclusion that technical skills were becoming obsolete? Setting down his tools, Warren turned to face his son directly. "Engineering will always be needed, Billy. The world is changing, yes, but that just means different kinds of engineering will be important. The key is to be adaptable, to keep learning." "Like you did?" Billy asked, his eyes serious, "switching from the plant to being a mechanic." Warren had never thought of his career change as something that might inspire his son. He'd seen it as a necessity, a fallback plan when his real career collapsed. But looking at it through Billy's eyes, he could see another perspective, that of a father who had faced adversity and found a new path forward. "I wish I'd been more adaptable sooner," Warren admitted. "I spent too many years believing there was only one way to be successful, only one job that defined who I was. Don't make that mistake." Billy nodded slowly. "So you think engineering is a good choice?" "I think it's an excellent choice if it interests you. The specific field might change over time. Maybe it's mechanical, maybe electrical, maybe something to do with computers or energy. But the fundamental skills of problem solving, of understanding how systems work, those will always be valuable." As he said the words, Warren realized he was not just advising his son, but articulating a truth he was still coming to accept himself. The specific job title, the specific industry, these were less important than the underlying abilities and adaptability that allowed a person to navigate change. "Thanks, Dad." Billy picked up a rag and began wiping down a part that Warren had set aside. "And for what it's worth, I think you're a better mechanic than you were a plant worker." Warren raised an eyebrow. "How would you know?" "You hardly ever saw me working at the plant." "Exactly," Billy said with a slight smile. "But I see you here in the garage all the time now, and at Kowalski's when I stop by you seem, I don't know, more like yourself." The observation hit Warren with unexpected force. More like himself. Was that possible? Had the job that he'd believed defined him actually been obscuring some essential part of his nature? Had the security he'd so valued come at the cost of a deeper satisfaction he hadn't recognized was missing? These questions followed Warren in the months that came, as he continued to build his new career at Kowalski's, as he earned additional ASE certifications, as he watched the Dresser power station fall into disrepair. The cooling towers still stood, visible from certain vantage points around Terre, but they no longer emitted steam. The parking lot grew weeds through cracks in the asphalt. Rumors circulated about potential buyers, about demolition plans, about environmental cleanup costs that made redevelopment unlikely. Some former plant workers moved away from Terre, following jobs to Indianapolis or Chicago or further afield. Others found positions locally, often at lower wages and with fewer benefits than they'd had at Dresser. A few, like Dave Milliken, struggled for years, picking up temporary work and odd jobs while watching their savings dwindle and their houses fall into foreclosure. Warren maintained contact with some of his old colleagues, meeting occasionally for coffee or a beer, sharing news of job opportunities or mutual acquaintances. These gatherings grew less frequent over time, as lives diverged and new routines took hold. But the connection remained, a shared history that didn't need constant reinforcement to stay meaningful. By the time Billy graduated high school in the spring of 1985, Warren had been at Kowalski's for over a year. He'd earned 4 ASE certifications and had been promoted to shop foreman when Tim left to open his own garage on the north side of town. His salary had increased to match Ray's former rate, and while it still didn't equal his earnings at Dresser, the family had adjusted their expectations and expenses accordingly. Rita continued working full-time at the hospital, finding unexpected satisfaction in the increased responsibilities she'd taken on. Their marriage, strained during the worst months of Warren's unemployment, had regained its footing on this new, more equal terrain, where both contributed essential income and neither took the other's work for granted. Billy did receive that baseball scholarship to Purdue, choosing to major in mechanical engineering with a minor in computer science. A combination that reflected both his father's influence and his own recognition of where future opportunities might lie. On the day they drove Billy to West Lafayette to start his freshman year, Warren and Rita made a detour on their way home, taking a route that passed by the Dresser Power Station. They pulled into the empty parking lot, the car crunching over gravel and broken glass as Warren guided it to a stop facing the silent cooling towers. For several minutes, they sat without speaking, looking at the abandoned facility that had played such a central role in their lives. Weeds grew tall around the base of the security fence. Windows were broken in the administrative building. A faded sign warned no trespassing in red letters nearly obscured by rust stains. "Do you ever miss it?" Rita asked finally, her hand finding Warren's across the center console. Warren considered the question. Did he miss the steady paycheck, the clear expectations, the camaraderie? Yes, sometimes. Did he miss the work itself, the person he'd been while doing it? That was more complicated. "I miss what it represented," he said slowly. "The certainty, the feeling that I knew exactly who I was and what tomorrow would bring." He squeezed her hand. "But I don't miss who I became toward the end, someone so afraid of change that I couldn't see any other possibilities for myself." Rita nodded, understanding. "When my father lost his job at the paper mill in '63, he never really recovered. Not because he couldn't find other work, but because he couldn't imagine himself as anything else. I was so afraid that would happen to you." "It almost did," Warren acknowledged. "If you hadn't pushed me, if Billy hadn't supported me, if Joe hadn't taken a chance on me." He left the thought unfinished, the alternatives too painful to articulate. "But that's not what happened," Rita reminded him gently. "You found another way forward, not everyone did." It was true. Warren thought of Dave Milliken, who had eventually moved to Indianapolis to live with his brother after losing his house. Of Hank Wilcox, who had taken early retirement and depleted his savings trying to keep his children in college. Of others who had fallen into depression, alcoholism, or worse, as their identities collapsed along with their livelihoods. "I was lucky," Warren said. "You were resilient," Rita corrected. "And you had help, yes. But you also chose to accept that help, to start over, to learn new things at an age when many men would have given up." Warren looked at the cooling towers one last time, then started the car. As they pulled away from the Dresser Power Station, he felt a sense of closure that had been elusive in the chaotic months following its shutdown. The plant had been a chapter in his life, an important one, but not the whole story. What had happened in Terre when the coal plants began to disappear was not just an ending but also, for some, a beginning. 6 years later, in the summer of 1991, Warren Steiner stood in front of a small storefront on Washington Avenue, keys in hand, heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. The sign above the door read Steiner Automotive Repair in fresh blue paint. Below it, in smaller letters, Foreign and Domestic Engine Specialists. After 7 years at Kowalski's, Warren had taken the leap into business ownership. Joe had been supportive, even helping with the business plan and introducing Warren to the bank manager who approved the loan. Rita had thrown herself into researching insurance options, tax requirements, and marketing strategies. Billy, now a college graduate working for an engineering firm in Indianapolis, had driven down on weekends to help renovate the building. As Warren unlocked the door of his own shop for the first time, he thought about the long, winding path that had led him here. From the confident young man who had followed his father into the dresser power station, to the devastated middle-aged worker facing unemployment, to this newest incarnation. Small business owner, master technician, entrepreneur, none of these transformations had been easy. Each had required letting go of old certainties, embracing new challenges, acknowledging both limitations and possibilities he hadn't previously recognized in himself. The bell above the door jingled as Warren stepped inside. The space smelled of fresh paint and new equipment. Two service bays waited, lifts installed, and tools arranged with meticulous care. A small but comfortable waiting area featured chairs salvaged from Rita's parents' house and a coffee maker that had been a gift from Billy. Everything was ready. Warren had already lined up several regular customers from his days at Kowalski's. He had apprenticed a young mechanic named Carlos who would be starting next week. Rita had arranged to reduce her hours at the hospital to help with bookkeeping and customer service. It was a risk, certainly. Small businesses failed every day, especially in a city like Terre, where the economic aftershocks of industrial decline continued to reverberate. But it was a calculated risk, one based on skills Warren knew he possessed, on a service people would always need, on a community he understood. As Warren moved through the shop, making final checks before opening officially the next day, he found himself thinking about his father. Howard Steiner had believed in the permanence of institutions like the Dresser Power Station. He had taught his son that loyalty to a company would be rewarded with lifelong security. That worldview had crumbled along with the American industrial base, leaving men like Warren to navigate a new reality where such promises no longer held. But Howard had taught his son other things too: the value of skilled work, the satisfaction of solving problems, the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. These lessons had proven more durable, more applicable to the world as it was becoming. "What do you think, Dad?" Warren asked aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the empty shop. "Did I finally get it right?" There was no answer, of course. Just the distant sound of traffic on Washington Avenue, the hum of the new air conditioning unit, the ticking of the clock on the wall that would mark the hours of this new chapter in the life of Warren Steiner. Outside, the sun was setting over Terre, casting long shadows across a city still finding its way forward after the loss of the industries that had once defined it. Inside Steiner Automotive Repair, a man who had once defined himself entirely by his job at the power plant was discovering that identity was not something fixed and unchangeable, but rather a continuing process of becoming, of losing and finding, of endings and beginnings, of learning how to build something new from the materials of the past.